Jeff reminisced about his first day in the dormitory, when he hoped never to encounter those he considered enemies again. His neighbor, a short young man, approached him and asked for help in lifting his belongings to the upper bunk. Despite his busy schedule, the protagonist agreed. The cheerful newcomer was pleased with his admission to the university, for everyone treated him well, and even now, when he asked Jeff to tidy up their room, he received a positive response. As soon as the protagonist was alone, he heard the voice of the superintendent, who had brought the newcomer to the room and was showing him where his bed was. Upon seeing Jeff, the man immediately informed him that he would need to assist with settling the newcomer and explain everything about the place. The young man was stunned when he saw with whom he would now have to share the room. Terrence looked a little different now than he had before, but his face was still easily recognizable after so many months. The protagonist treated his new roommate with disdain and aggression, to which Terrence responded with complete indifference. This infuriated Jeff even more, driving him to yell at his acquaintance for refusing to engage in conversation or even argue with him. Their past conflict had coincided with a particularly difficult time for the protagonist, so now even Terrence's appearance reminded him of all that. The protagonist did not intend to let his enemy live peacefully, so he wouldn't even let him unpack without causing a scene. In Jeff's view, one couldn't forget so quickly everything that had happened between them, and even now, it was wrong to pretend nothing had occurred. Terrence, however, confidently declared that it was all over for them. The protagonist disagreed and could hardly contain his own anger. To calm down a little, he decided to leave the room and stay the night at his parents' house so he wouldn't see his enemy. But despite this, he couldn't fall asleep until late at night. Remembering Terrence's words that their conflict was already over, Jeff dreamt that the person responsible for the troubles that had so suddenly appeared in his life was at his mercy. He could do whatever he pleased with this dreadful fellow, yet for some reason felt peculiar emotions while gazing at his face. Suddenly, Jeff awoke in his bed and realized he was frightened by this terrifying and incomprehensible dream. The emotions he had once experienced were now returning to him, and the young man couldn't fathom why. Despite the lateness of the hour, the protagonist couldn't sleep after what had happened, so he decided to head to the kitchen. There, he drank some water and seemed to feel slightly better when he suddenly heard screams coming from one of the rooms. His mother was also awake, screaming like a madwoman in her room, but this didn't seem to surprise the young man too much. The housekeeper approached Jeff, astonished to see him awake at such a late hour, hoping he wouldn't witness his mother's worsening condition. It turned out that since he had left for university, the woman's condition had deteriorated significantly, as she was left without close family. Since the protagonist's father had left the family, she had never been able to be happy or even live a normal life. The young man was visibly distressed, realizing that his move to the dormitory had worsened the condition of such an important person in his life. To calm down a bit, he headed to the hall where he practiced boxing, even without an opponent, which helped him. A week passed before the protagonist fully recovered, for the appearance of his enemy in the dormitory had taken him by surprise. Their mutual neighbor noticed this too, and now wanted to learn as much as possible about the reason for such complicated relations between the young men. Jeff did not deny that he had known the new resident of their room before, but he didn't share any details, especially since he noticed Terrence at his desk. The man seemed to be in another reality, as he paid no attention to anyone around him. Such behavior seemed very strange, for even when their friendly neighbor discussed with the protagonist the possibility of going to a restaurant together, Terrence remained indifferent. Jeff clearly didn't want to dine with all the room's residents either, so he sought a way to decline the offer. However, looking at his friend's friendly smile, he couldn't refuse and watched with interest as he tried to invite Terrence as well. Despite the young man's complete indifference, the neighbor tried to be polite to him and foster normal interaction in the room. Nevertheless, the newcomer declined the chance to befriend his roommates without emotion or regret, which seemed strange from an outsider's perspective. Such a reaction astonished everyone present, and for several long seconds, the room fell silent. However, the young man then tried to behave as if everything was fine, and suggested postponing the meeting to another day so that Terrence could attend. But he no longer wanted to converse. Without a word, the silent neighbor rose from his seat and headed for the exit to avoid the conversation. No one had expected this, for it was exceedingly rude to the person who had tried to be friendly. The young man's eyes showed no emotion. He was utterly disinterested in what was happening around him. Clearly, the one who had tried to organize the gathering was disappointed by such a response, and the protagonist was equally enraged. Even though he was unlikely to want to spend time with such an unpleasant person, he didn't intend to offend his friend either. To calm down a little, Jeff also left the room, warning beforehand that if Terrence did show up at the meeting, he himself should not be invited. This, of course, further disheartened their neighbor, who, seeing the tense atmosphere in the room, had hoped to mend relations between the two. Even during class, the protagonist couldn't focus on his studies. When the lecture was over, the young man received a message from one of his neighbors asking him to come home earlier, if possible. This was because the newcomer still didn't have the keys to the room and needed to be let in when he returned. The other young man wouldn't be back until late at night and didn't want Terrence waiting by the door. The protagonist didn't know what to do, as he wanted to fulfill the request but didn't want to help his enemy. Just then, a girl from his group approached him and asked him to have dinner together since classes were already over. Jeff liked the student both in appearance and character, so he immediately decided to accept her invitation to a date. After all, the problems of another person were none of his concern, and they weren't friends who would help each other out in difficult situations. When darkness fell, the young man dined joyfully in a cozy place in the company of a beautiful companion, still thinking about Terrence. The girl was very sweet, and they had a pleasant time together, but focusing on the conversation was extremely difficult. After the meal, she suggested that Jeff go to the cinema, as there were plenty of places for such leisure not far from the university. It seemed there was nothing wrong with going with her, as the offer was quite tempting. Later, the protagonist returned home, blaming himself somewhat for not being able to refuse the girl just because he found her attractive. It was already very late, and he hoped that the others had returned to the dormitory room by now. However, when Jeff approached the door, he saw only the newcomer sitting beside it on the floor, reading a book. If he had wanted to, he could have contacted his roommates by asking other residents of the building for their phone numbers. This was probably how the protagonist tried to justify his rather unpleasant behavior. However, for some reason, Terrence couldn't simply ask others for help, but never explained why. Once again, the young man's reaction angered Jeff, who glared at his new roommate with aggression, realizing that he was playing the victim. To express his hatred for his roommate, he openly declared that he had purposely returned home late, so Terrence couldn't get into the room. In this way, he tried to provoke some kind of reaction from his roommate, hoping to anger him, but to no avail. The young man, with the same indifference, entered the room first and simply continued with his usual activities. As if he hadn't noticed the sarcasm and hatred directed at him, none of it seemed to matter. All evening, Terrence went about his business without even glancing at his rude roommate, who hadn't helped him despite knowing he should have. The young man was brewing instant noodles, clearly very hungry and certainly not having had time to eat at the university. This made the protagonist feel ashamed, but he still tried to convince himself that his actions were justified. Ultimately, realizing that his roommate still displayed nothing but indifference, he decided not to worry about him any longer. Soon, the other residents of the room arrived, initially looking quite cheerful, but the atmosphere in the dwelling quickly soured their mood. Both students present appeared dejected, even angry, and naturally, no one wanted to talk. The most sociable of the room's residents decided to invite Jeff to the store and, at the same time, discuss what was happening. He tried to uncover the cause of the conflict between the protagonist and the newcomer, as it was clear they despised each other. If it were all that simple, the young man would surely have confided in his friend, but given the situation, he chose to deny everything. Nevertheless, the roommate advised him to try to forget past grievances and start afresh with the young man to improve the atmosphere in the room. To avoid quarreling with his friend, he tried to be cautious with his words and not blame him for everything. In his friend's opinion, Jeff was a very sociable person and could find common ground with anyone, so he would surely do so with the newcomer as well. Suddenly, the protagonist reacted with unexpected aggression, not understanding why the kind neighbor was being friendly to such an utterly indifferent person. He had no intention of pretending to be a kind person, so he left, leaving the distressed young man alone in the street. Jeff couldn't accept that such an indifferent person could even exist, and living in the same room with him was all the more unbearable. Catching up with the young man, his roommate tried to explain his tolerant behavior by saying he knew about the unfortunate one's past. He had missed a year of studies due to health problems and was surely now struggling to adapt. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered how he had fought with him before and thought that this might have been the reason. However, he also understood that their hatred had been mutual before, and now it seemed that Terrence was utterly indifferent to everything around him. Nevertheless, the situation made Jeff feel guilty once again, and his friend realized he was probably meddling where he shouldn't. To soothe his friendly neighbor a little, he tried to understand the situation and soften his attitude toward Terrence. In the evening, the young men decided to go to bed a little earlier and soon turned off the light in the room so as not to disturb anyone. Surprisingly, the newcomer always fell asleep very early, which seemed strange considering the usual habits of students. The protagonist tried to convince himself that he didn't care about what was happening and finally stopped thinking about his enemy. This continued into the next morning, as the young man tried not to follow his roommate's actions or be interested in how he lived. Terrence, however, took his pills daily, but kept it hidden from others, as if it were a secret. One dose of the medication fell to the floor, but instead of discarding it, the peculiar young man picked it up and swallowed it. Clearly, there was significant misunderstanding and awkwardness between the two, created by memories of the past. Meanwhile, their roommate entered the room with a smile and announced he had brought an assortment of buns for everyone. Jeff politely declined, having already eaten breakfast not long ago, suggesting it would be better if the young man enjoyed them himself. The roommate then approached Terrence, hoping he would accept the treat, and began explaining which flavors each bun had. However, he clearly couldn't even look at the food and immediately refused, covering his face with his hand to block the smell. Yet the roommate persisted, urging him to take at least one fresh bun and bringing the bag closer to him. Then, with a sudden motion, Terrence pushed the food away, knocking it out of the friendly young man's hands and scattering it across the floor. The protagonist watched all this with a mix of surprise and anger, seeing how upset the good-natured young man was because of it. The one who had provoked the unpleasant situation made no attempt to rectify it, simply watched the proceedings with the same indifference. The young man who brought the buns, on the other hand, apologized and immediately started picking them up from the floor, pretending everything was fine. However, Jeff decided to intervene, snatching the bag from his friend's hands, who didn't want to escalate the conflict. He hurled the food into the new roommate's face and began shouting at him for his contemptuous attitude toward others. Terrence, his face marked by an injury from the blow, chose not to respond, probably realizing he was in the wrong as well. The protagonist remained furious, grabbing his enemy by the shirt and demanding an apology from the unfortunate man. Their neighbor prevented Jeff from hurting the newcomer by grabbing his arm and persuading him to stop, arguing that nothing serious had happened. However, this only enraged Jeff further, and he began yelling even at the person he liked, unable to comprehend the motives behind such kindness. While Terrence remained silent, not defending himself, his actions were justified by the very one who had suffered from them. The friendly young man even ushered the protagonist out of the room, telling him to calm down before returning. The neighbor followed suit, leaving the newcomer alone to give him a chance to recover from what had just occurred. Clearly, the kind young man felt sorry for the unfortunate one who had been injured over such a trifle, but there was nothing more he could do, and Terrence, with an indifferent gaze, watched the students leave the room, not daring to say anything to them. Soon, all their friends gathered in the dining hall during the school day. The menu varied enough for each to choose a dish to their liking. The sociable student spotted Terrence in the crowd, who was only trying to get to the food counter. At such a time, it's hard to find an empty spot at the tables, so it was unclear where he intended to go afterward. One of the girls in the group suggested inviting him to their table, and most agreed, hoping to elicit at least some conversation from him. Although the newcomer was very distant, they didn't lose hope of persuading him to start socializing with everyone. Moreover, a seat next to the girl had become available, and she was more than willing to invite him over. Only the protagonist looked angry about this, not wanting to see his enemy, who not only annoyed him but also showed disdain for others. He understood that each time he saw his face, he felt increasing hatred and disgust for this strange person. Arriving at the table, Terrence brought only a bowl of plain rice porridge, much to the surprise of the others. They didn't speak to him politely, but at least they spoke frankly, which couldn't help but please Jeff. Suddenly, the girl decided to inquire if the newcomer had a sister, as he looked handsome, implying that his sister might be attractive too. However, he denied this, visibly saddened, and rose from his seat, intending to leave and avoid continuing such an unpleasant conversation. His words infuriated the protagonist so much that he stood up and attacked Terrence right in front of everyone. He knew the young man had a sister, who had been the reason Jeff's father left the family, lost a fortune, and fell into debt. Only when the neighbors pulled the protagonist away did he let go of the young man he had almost struck. The latter, visibly saddened, chose not to continue his meal, took his plate, and left the dining hall. His expression remained as indifferent as ever, which both surprised and disheartened Jeff. No one understood why he reacted that way, since those around them didn't know about their past personal tragedy. The protagonist thought it would probably be easier for him if the new roommate simply interacted normally with the others. Later, the sociable young man went looking for Terrence and found him sitting on a bench near the university building. For some reason, the friend decided to apologize for the aggressive young man's behavior, trying to explain his actions. The newcomer barely reacted to what was being said, only answering directly when asked a question, unable to ignore it. The neighbor told Terrence about the character of the one who hated him and even hoped that things would still improve between the two. He also gave advice on how best to deal with the negative emotions that Terrence had harbored for so long. Such care made the unfortunate young man remember the times when he was not so lonely and still hoped for a better future. Back then, he was very emotional and took joy in the smallest things, like seeing a butterfly in the cold season. He was preparing dinner for his sister was due to arrive soon and would be very hungry after work. Terrence made the best dish he could for his loved one, and even though she hadn't returned yet, she could reheat it when she arrived. He also intended to release the pigeons that belonged to her so they would return in time. Looking at a small chest of drawers with photos of his parents and grandmother, he prayed for protection for himself and his sister. He wanted to ease the life of this important relative and did everything he could to help her. Then, he suddenly hesitated to release the birds, as he didn't like them, and his sister wasn't answering his calls. Waiting for the girl, he fell asleep right at the table and only woke up when he heard the doorbell. Terrence thought it might be his sister, so he ran to open the door, hoping to see her as soon as possible. The moment he saw who had arrived, he immediately realized that his life would never be the same again. Later, Terrence was brought to the morgue to identify the body, and the staff were surprised that he had come alone. Nevertheless, they had no choice but to show him his sister's body and ask if it was indeed the person they suspected. From the unfortunate young man's reaction, everything was clear. He covered his mouth with his hand to stifle a scream and broke down in tears at the sight. Even on his way back home, Terrence couldn't believe the girl had died, thinking it simply couldn't be true. Suddenly, another student grabbed his arm, questioning him about the recently deceased relative. He looked very angry, and as soon as he got confirmation that he had found the right person, he immediately threw Terrence away from him. Jeff accused the unfortunate young man, claiming that because of his deceased sister, the protagonist's father had crashed and also died. Terrence didn't understand what was being said, as he didn't know that a member of his family had a lover, so he couldn't continue the conversation. The grieving young man who had lost his father thought he could find out from the stranger the reasons behind the tragedy. Moreover, he blamed the unfortunate young man for what had happened, even though he was also a victim of the situation, and hadn't yet come to terms with it. Only when Terrence grasped the whole situation did he understand what the man beating him was talking about. His father had helped their family financially for some time, but he could never have imagined that his sister had a romantic relationship with him. Gathering his courage, he struck back, defending the honor of the girl who was already dead but still mattered greatly to him. Furthermore, Terrence began showing clear aggression in return, as he wasn't yet ready to endure everything that was happening to him. However, his opponent still proved much stronger than he was, quickly throwing the young man to the ground and trying to strangle him. It wasn't clear what exactly Jeff intended to do, for no matter how much the girl's brother regretted, he couldn't bring back those who were gone. However, there was no remorse on his part. The young man denied not only that his relative had a romantic relationship with the man, but also that she was dead. The circumstances that had brought these two together were dreadful, and only outsiders managed to break up their fight. Both decided it would be best never to meet again, but unfortunately, now they were forced to live in the same room. Meanwhile, the friendly neighbor tried to distract Terrence from his obsessive thoughts and draw his attention to the conversation. Once he regained his composure, he immediately apologized for the rudeness with which he had previously treated the good-natured young man. The latter didn't take those words too seriously and simply assured him there was no need to worry about what had happened. He tried to convey to his roommate that he should be more concerned about himself, and that if he smiled more often, he would look better. However, he couldn't shake off the memories, just like Jeff, as they dragged him into a cycle of negative emotions. Meanwhile, the protagonist was training in boxing with his coach, trying to feel better in this way. The young man was particularly aggressive in his punches, scaring his opponent so much that he was now afraid to come to the next training session. Nevertheless, the coach tried to remain calm and even support his student, who clearly looked depressed. The instructor's young daughter ran up to him, clearly missing her father too much. They had a wonderful time together, which made Jeff remember his own father, with whom he had once been so happy. Thus, the young man felt joy and longing simultaneously, for he still held warm memories of the deceased in his heart. Soon, the roommates noticed that most of the room had become cluttered, and although it seemed they hadn't cleaned for only a few weeks, the situation was catastrophic. What seemed surprising was that the space belonging to the newcomer remained impeccably clean, in a way that hardly seemed possible if someone were living there. Terrence himself was still lying in bed and hadn't woken up, even though, as usual, he had gone to sleep much earlier than the others. The young man probably had no classes, just like Jeff that day, so by an unfortunate coincidence, they were left alone together. The protagonist didn't want to stay in the room with his enemy, so he decided to go for a walk. Suddenly, he glanced at his sleeping roommate and was very surprised to see him crying, but he still decided to flee the scene. It didn't really matter what was happening with the newcomer. The young man shouldn't worry about it, as they were enemies. Unexpectedly, Jeff found out that he was attending the same lectures as his enemy, which didn't please him at all. The girls nearby gossiped about what had happened in the dining hall and about Terrence's sister, whom he was hiding for some unknown reason. It seemed everyone already knew about what had happened in the protagonist's family, so they spoke freely about it all. The newcomer couldn't bear it and stood up to ask the professor if he could leave, citing feeling unwell. Even after the unfortunate young man left the room, they continued whispering behind his back, behaving despicably. Jeff couldn't tolerate such treatment and started shouting, despite the fact that it was about his enemy. He openly told his classmates that they shouldn't speak ill of someone without knowing anything about their life. The young man also asked to leave the room and went to find the insulted Terrence, intending to talk to him, perhaps for the first time. At that moment, the young man was in the restroom, feeling unwell, swallowing pills in the hope that they would help him. The protagonist realized that he too wasn't feeling like himself and was angry for letting those words affect him. Suddenly, in the corridor, he met his enemy, who was already pale and now looked even worse than before. Before the young man encountered his neighbor, he was confident he could convince himself to be indifferent to this person. However, as soon as he ran into him, he immediately called out, realizing that Terrence was feeling unwell. Later, Jeff met with the superintendent, who was very surprised that the student had returned from class so early. Moreover, his roommate had come home not long before, leading the man to conclude that the two young men had quarreled. However, he hoped the protagonist would be more sensible, as he had very good relationships with the others in the dormitory. No matter the circumstances in life, one should never resort to aggression, let alone physical force. Since everyone around them knew their story, the young man decided to ask the older man how he would handle such a situation. He couldn't answer, as it was clear he doubted his own integrity, and besides, when things unfold like this, it's hard to remain a good person. Jeff thought it would be best if the two of them lived in separate rooms and even asked the superintendent for help, but there seemed to be no available spaces. In the evening, the protagonist returned home and was even able to have dinner with his mother despite her ailment. The woman asked her son about university life, but he didn't go into details or mention whom he had met there. He also noted that he wouldn't be able to return home in a week because he would have to stay at the dormitory. It seemed his mother was doing much better, as she looked like a perfectly healthy person, which seemed strange. In the morning, Jeff woke up in his comfortable bed and reflected on how everyone had advised him to learn to control his emotions. It seemed quite difficult, but he noticed something odd about himself. When his roommate cried in his sleep, he couldn't remain indifferent. This cast doubt on the hatred he usually felt toward this person, who had been involved in the destruction of his family. In the evening, the protagonist returned to the dormitory early and met the friendly roommate who was preparing dinner for everyone. Terrence wasn't in the room, which greatly surprised the arriving young man, but it soon became clear that he always left the dormitory on that day. The protagonist might not have known this because he rarely showed up there on weekends, but it was hardly a cause for concern. Jeff tried to appear completely uninterested in where his roommate was, intending to help his friend. However, as soon as the latter cut his finger, Jeff immediately ran outside under the pretext of needing to buy a Band-Aid. Walking through the night city, he saw his enemy in the back seat of a luxurious car and was very surprised that he knew someone with such a vehicle.